Hello, in this paper I'd like to talk about emigration, amnesia and nostalgia. And this is part of a wider project that I've been working on for some time, which is looking at migration discourses and memory in a wider context. I'm interested in all different forms of migration. And because I've been looking at this from a historical perspective, as I've worked through the analysis and the data, it's become apparent how central memory is to structuring our contemporary understandings of migration and what's salient about migration. So this falls into three areas of the idea of discursive memory, this shared set of frames for describing migration, and nostalgia and amnesia, which I'm going to talk about today. So for this paper, I'm talking particularly about emigration, although the wider project looks at all forms of migration. But I really wanted to foreground emigration for this particular event. And I can talk about, the reasons why in terms of theoretical and methodological motivations, although it's somewhat arbitrary as a distinction between them. But by theoretical, what I really wanted to get to was the underpinning issue with only focusing on immigration when we say we're looking at migration. And this is that if we ignore immigration, we collude in the discursive construction of migration as immigration, and therefore subscribe somehow to the view that the only salient form of migration is immigration, which is the dominant tone in public discourse at present, at least in the UK. And in turn, what happens is that this perpetuates a cycle in which people don't see themselves as part of a migration cycle and overestimate the scale and impact of immigration. From a methodological perspective, we can draw on work by King, who talks about the ways in which we need to deconstruct traditional migration dichotomies in order to develop new ways of studying mobility. And so this gives us a methodological route into the study of migration discourses. And in my own work on combining corpus linguistics and discourse analysis, I've really emphasized the need to look both ways when we investigate any particular topic. So in order to approach how emigration is represented, I'm drawing on corpus linguistics and discourse analysis. And when we talk about corpus linguistics, very often what we think about is the amount of data that we can handle. And it's true, it gives us a way of handling more data than ever before. And particularly with the new corpora that have been developed, we've got access to an unprecedented length of diachronic comparison. And vitally, we can look at continuous stretches now, not samples that we've thought might be important and might be useful, but the whole lot, and see what comes out of the data. But more interesting, more important for me, is that corpus linguistics gives us a new way of looking at data. The language looks different when you look at a lot of it at once. You can see different patterns by coming up and looking down on the data. And furthermore, that continuous set of data gives us a way of tracing discourse development, which, because of lack of access to data, is something we haven't done that much of in discourse analysis to date. So I'm hoping that by bringing these together, we can find ways of analysing and interpreting the data meaningfully and from different perspectives. So the corpora that I'm using for the wider project are made up of press corpora and parliamentary corpora. For this particular paper, I'm just focusing on the Times. So I'll be using this wonderful resource that was created at Lancaster University, which is a continuous corpus, about 10.5 billion words of all of the Times newspapers which we have access to, so going back to 1785. And this is supplemented by a corpus built by Dario Del Fante, who's also speaking in this panel, and he built that when he was a research assistant at Sussex. That brings us up to 2018. Now, obviously, working with such a long distance approach brings with it certain difficulties. These relate to the quantity of text, but also the quality of the text. The OCR, the optical character recognition, is not always very accurate. There are issues of cultural unfamiliarity. I'm not a native speaker of 19th century British English. And of course, the language changes. Words change their meanings. Meanings change their words. The genre itself changes. But I'm going to focus on that issue with words changing meanings, with an example of the frequency of emigrants, immigrants, and migrants. Now, if you look in the OED, you'll find that all three terms entered the English language at the same point in time. But we can see they weren't picked up and used in the same ways. And what you could see in this chart, and what some people have seen, is that the British press was preoccupied with emigration throughout the 19th century, and then with immigration. This reflects the major patterns of mobility throughout those periods. But this is not the full picture at all. These terms are not used in the past the way they're used today, with this sort of polar meaning of movement towards and movement from. So if you look at this extract from the 1840s, you see the reference to Australian emigrants, but these are not people leaving Australia, these are people moving to Australia. Similarly, you see here Guyanese emigrants to Britain. Now, the newspaper extract is written from the perspective of Georgetown, but still what you're getting in a newspaper published in the UK is emigrants being used to refer to people moving into Britain. So we need to be very careful how we interpret the terms that are used, because it's not the same as the way they're used in the present day. So in order to do this project, I had to draw on a very wide range of terms. So when I talk about how migrants were represented, I'm not just looking at the term migrants, for instance, but at exiles, colonists, emigrants, aliens, settlers, refugees, immigrants, evacuees, expats, expatriates, boat people, migrants, and some others which haven't even made it on to there. So it's a very wide understanding of what migration is. And in this paper, I want to draw on these issues of amnesia and nostalgia. And I'm thinking about these as being collective cultural phenomena, which crucially have structural properties in the discourse. The discourse of migration is shaped by what we don't say, as well as by what we do say. And I'm going to start with amnesia. So the first way we can start to think about amnesia is simply by looking at the naming choices which are used in the Times in 2018, so the closest to the present day. And you can see that those terms which today tend to be used or are more likely to be used to people leaving the UK, emigrants, expats, expatriates, POMs, POMmies, these are a tiny proportion of all of the names that we've got for migrants. It's dominated by immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants. So the first point is there's just very little mention of emigration. And yet, if we look at the estimates of international migration in the UK, we can see that emigration is absolutely there. It exists. So we don't have a direct correlation between the amount of emigration and the newsworthiness of emigration. So this is the first element of amnesia. The second element of amnesia relates to the historical perspective. So we can see that these terms have been used more in the past. If we pull out expatriates and you look at that peak around the 1960s, and then you look at the chart on the right-hand side, you can see very clearly that when expatriates peaked as a newsworthy term, it was not peaking as an actual statistical phenomenon. So we can really challenge that connection between the newspapers reflecting simple social realities. They're reflecting constructed social realities of what's important at any moment in time. And we can also use this chart to pull out the third point relating to amnesia. So what we've got in this chart is terms which are pre-modified by British, English, Scottish, Scotch, and Welsh, so that we can really say these terms are being used to talk about people leaving the UK. And what we can see is that there's a very wide range of terms being used to talk about people leaving the UK in the past. If you look at that 2010 slot, you can see that they're all going down, apart from expats. They're all disappearing, but there's been a much wider range in the past. So we might pull out, for instance, refugees, which peaks in the beginning of the 1900s. And this is a typical example of the newspaper reporting of British refugees, where it talks about the sufferings of British refugees in South Africa. Or we might see colonists, peaks in a similar time period, and here we see reference to British colonists to the Canadian Northwest, who are to be granted special facilities and given protection from encroachment by other nationalities. So these forms, these are very much absent from our contemporary understanding. The idea that there were British refugees and the dominance of British colonists are not part of that collective present day understanding. And we can see this narrowing of the range of immigrant experiences, even if we just look at the contemporary data. So where reference is made to current British immigration, it tends to reflect an image of lifestyle migration. Although the statistics tell us that the countries with most British-born residents are quite diverse: Australia, USA, Canada, France, Germany, Netherlands, Philippines. The only two that were associated with the term emigrants in the 2010 decade of the Times is The only countries are Australia and France. And typically you would get this kind of image as illustrated on the right. The thousands of British emigrants buying houses in France will tell you that they're looking for that elusive, nebulous ingredient, the one we all think we're missing, quality of life. So very clear representation of so-called lifestyle migration, of privileged migrants who are able to buy properties, who are not dependent on finding employment to support their move. And so what's happening here, and this has been very well documented in work by Benson O'Reilly, is that these stereotypes, which they talk about as most notably those of patriotic pensioners living lazy lives in the sun, and this is with reference to British emigrants in the EU around the time of Brexit, these stereotypes fail to reflect the complexity of the lives of this richly diverse population. These narratives reinforce rather than debunk ideas about migrancy that see it as deviant. So by this partiality, this expression only of a very small range of emigrant experiences, the emigrants, the people leaving the UK, are distanced yet further from the us group, from the target readership of these articles. Furthermore, when we do find reference to British emigrants, people leaving the UK, they are likely to be historicised references. In fact, if we look at the decade from 2000 to 2009, just 4% of references to emigrants refer to people leaving the UK at the time of writing. So if you remember that bar chart we saw at the beginning, when we saw that emigrants, expats, expatriates accounts for a tiny proportion of the overall mentions of people who move, it's actually even smaller than that. It's 4% in the first decade and 11% in the second decade, actually being contemporary. Otherwise, they're much more likely to be like the example you've got on the right there, where it says, for this reason, the majority of British emigrants in the 17th century went not to America, but to the West Indies. So emigration is very much absent from contemporary discussions of migration, and where it does occur, it's distanced from the present. So what we've got so far then for immigration amnesia is that there's very little reference to people moving out of the UK. There's very little match between actual mobility and presence in migration discourse in the present day. The full range of naming choices and migration roles used in the past is largely forgotten in the present. The portrayal of present day UK immigration is highly partial, and the reference to UK immigration is likely to be historically distant. So what does this actually do to our discourses of migration? Well, what happens is that it distances the UK reader from the cycle of migration. It makes those shared experiences of migration distant, and at the same time it pushes immigration to the UK to the foreground, because one is backgrounded and distant, and that leaves space for the other to become foregrounded and proximal. So what I'm going to do now is move on to thinking about nostalgia. And for this, I'm just going to pull on one element from the project, which is where I was looking at metaphors of migration and how we can use these to see nostalgia in our contemporary understandings of migration, in particular emigration, of course. So I'm interested in metaphors, partly because it was a way of handling the complexities of looking at such an extended time period. Because words change their meanings, we need some way to abstract out from the lexical level. And of course, a metaphor can be lexicalized in many different ways. So whether it's lexicalized as flow or flood or absorb, these are all water metaphors. And in terms of understanding the discourse, metaphor acts as a way of understanding and interpreting the world. And so by looking at the metaphors that were used, we can see what sorts of frames were being positive. And metaphor works both through discourse and at the level of discourse because it is evaluative and cumulative in nature. And it encompasses non-obvious meaning in discourse, which is, of course, so vital to discourse analysis. And finally, Bednarek posits that it's particularly important for establishing construals of newsworthy events, which makes it particularly relevant to looking at the press discourse. So we're going to start by looking at the water metaphors. So water metaphors could be lexicalized in a range of ways. Here you see two lexicalizations in this example, where the writer states there's a noticeable difference between the class of emigrants who go out to Australia and those who are pouring in a never-ceasing stream to America. So we've got two lexicalizations, pouring and stream, both referencing the water metaphor. And if we look at where these metaphors occurred across different naming choices and different time periods, we can see a pattern. that in the past we were getting water metaphors being used multiple times. That's what the blue box indicates, multiple times, and with a strong association with settlers and emigrants across the 19th century into the 20th century, but they're not used at all in the contemporary time period for those people. It's been distanced from them. However, it's used in the contemporary time period is with reference to migrants, immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. So what we're seeing is the way that a possible us group was framed in the past is actually the same as the way that a outsider group is being framed in the present. And this isn't something that's likely to be part of our popular understanding of migration, this similarity between the us group moving and the them group moving. We find something similar when we start to look at the commodity trade metaphors. So we've got two examples here, one from 1840, where it talks about whether we should allow a trade in emigrants to be carried on as a matter of private speculation for the profit of individuals. So the emigrants, the people here, very clearly posited as being products in which one can trade and gain profit. And we get a similar kind of framing in 1999 with a reference to trade in illegal immigrants. So these metaphors, like the water metaphors, dehumanizing metaphors, and here seen as a commodity. And these commodity metaphors were very strongly associated with settlers and immigrants in the earlier time periods. They're absent for those three names in the most recent time period, and instead they're associated with migrants, immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers. So the same pattern as before. The way in which the we group were referred to in the past is the same as the way in which the us group, the them group, is referred to now. The last metaphor I wanted to look at was that of guests. And here we might see guests being lexicalized with things like invited or welcomed, as in these examples from 1930 and 2004. So here we see it was a much less frequent metaphor, but it was strongly associated with settlers in 1920 and 1930. It's not associated with that group in the present day, and instead it's associated with migrants and asylum seekers. So exactly the same pattern as before. The way in which the we group was framed in the past is the same as the way in which the outsider group are framed today. We might want to pull out a couple of interesting points about how this metaphor is lexicalized. The first is we might notice that overstay is one way in which it's lexicalized in 2010. And so, of course, here it's not just a metaphor of migrants are guests, but it's migrants are unwelcome guests. So a very clear shift in the evaluation that's posited for them. And the second one is the reference to welcoming. So they're welcomed as guests, but actually this is part of the historicizing of particular forms of migration and reception. So it often occurs in patterns referring to a long and rich history of welcoming immigrants, a proud history of welcoming people who flee persecution. So this is an assertion, a nostalgic assertion of a particular form of behavior, which often serves to legitimate a hostile attitude in the present day. So what we've got so far then for emigration nostalgia is that the metaphors of migrants are water, migrants are commodities, and migrants are guests are shared across us then and them now. And these shared metaphors highlight the lack of agency for past emigrants. Those who were labelled as emigrants and settlers, they were resources, they were products for empire. They were not these sort of plucky explorers going off to discover new worlds. They were pawns, they were moved around, they were a natural resource. And where we get these same metaphors being used in the current day to position immigrants and asylum seekers and refugees, we've got the same natural source, but they're positioned as being natural threats at this point in time. So what does this study then tell us? What does understanding amnesia and nostalgia in migration and discourses or emigration discourses tell us about how people are represented? Well, what I want to argue is that amnesia and nostalgia are not incidental or accidental. They're absolutely central to maintaining and supporting a hostile discourse of migration. And this is because amnesia and nostalgia serve to distance the target audience, the UK reader of these newspapers, from the shared experiences of migration. And if you don't maintain this amnesia and nostalgia, then there could be an understanding of shared experiences, and therefore that hostile discourse would become more difficult to maintain. So thank you very much, and I look forward to talking about this and other themes in the discussion panel.